When we think about World War II, some images come to mind. Images of horror, dead bodies, the Holocaust, and ruthless ideologies battling against each other, in a war not only for domination, but also a war about forming a new world order. How do we remember the soldiers that embodied Nazi ideology? This question, among many others, has been asked by countless historians, and today we will look at the ideological soldiers of the Waffen SS, but from a slightly Danish perspective. Hello, I am Oscar Sils, a history student at the University of Copenhagen, and in today's episode I will tell you about one of the most infamous Nazi groups, the Waffen SS. Firstly, I will tell you about them and the collective memory that we have of them, and secondly, I will tell you about how the veterans of Danish volunteer SS soldiers tried to influence the perception of the Waffen SS and their role in World War II. We all know who the Waffen SS were and what they looked like, right? First they were Hitler's personal bodyguards and later a mass army in the Second World War. They were fanatical and ideological soldiers of Nazism that carried out the Holocaust. The purely Germanic elite soldiers led by Heinrich Himmler himself. Soldiers who were feared not only for their brutality but also their military capabilities. Right? Well, as you will come to learn in this video, the perceived images about the purely Germanic elite soldiers are actually not that correct as you might think they are. It seems that many modern movies and video games alike portray the SS as the epitome of pure German Nazism. And while it is true that the Waffen SS were often more fanatical than the Wehrmacht, and that some of their divisions were very capable military units, it is also a fact that by the end of the war, they had paradoxically evolved from a small, pure Aryan elite force into a large, transnational and multi-ethnic military organization. Also, in terms of their military prowess, it is true that some divisions were very effective, such as the 1st SS Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler and 2nd SS Das Reich, among others, but many of these divisions were, however, also heavily supplied with combat gear even to the end of the war, and thus their fighting capabilities would be better than other military divisions in Germany. Furthermore, it is worth to mention that many other SS divisions were not as formidable as the propaganda in our collective memory in movies or otherwise believes that they were. Many were by accounts not that impressive, and even if they were ideologically fanatic, they could still underperform. The main reason behind why the Waffen SS evolved into a multi-ethnic military organization was that many of the volunteers who joined SS divisions during the beginning of the war later died, and thus the organization began to recruit people of ethnicities that they would not have accepted during the beginning of the war. The SS recruits also went through worldview indoctrination classes before they were sent into the field. This was also a main reason why they were so fanatical, and thus the culture that the SS created led to their soldiers often committing more war crimes than the regular Wehrmacht. The Waffen SS expanded its rosters to neighboring countries already in the 1930s. However, these men were Germans. Other North Europeans began to be accepted in their ranks in 1938, but thus the idea of being purely Aryan was still prominent in the SS. However, this changed during the years of 1941 and 42, wherein divisions of non-Aryan races were created. Various Slavic people, such as the Russians and Ukrainians, served in SS divisions. There was even a Muslim division from Central Asia, and there was a high tolerance for Islamic beliefs and traditions in this division, which is interesting to think about. In 1941, many people in the Baltics, whom the Germans conquered from the Soviets, wanted to help the Germans against the Soviet Union, because they hoped that Germany would give their countries independence. This led to SS volunteer divisions of Slavic people that the Germans saw as Untermensch, and would not have accepted early in the war. One of the largest groups of foreigners in the SS was Ukrainians from eastern Poland. Many Ukrainians saw the Germans as liberators, and they were heavily against the Soviets after having experienced the Holodomor. which was a forced starvation by Stalin from 1932 to 33, in which Stalin killed millions of Ukrainians and other citizens in the Soviet Union by collectivizing farms by force. However, the Germans wanted to use their fertile land in the future to create a greater Germanic Reich in which the Ukrainian land would be farmed by German farmers. But for the war effort, the SS used their manpower in their divisions anyway. However, the German racist views made them not capitalizing on the anti-Soviet sentiments of the Ukrainians to the fullest of its potential. Many minorities, such as Muslims in the Soviet Union, also joined as volunteers in the Waffen SS, in what was called the Croatian 13th Waffen Mountain Division of the SS Handschar. Muslims from outside of the USSR also joined the Waffen SS. These Muslims were mostly minorities from the Balkans. However, it is important to note that many people who served in the SS during the end of the war were forced to do so by the Germans. This is also true for some Muslims, of course. In 1943, Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, even commanded that their division should not be served pork or alcohol. It was also commanded that all the soldiers in the division, even the German ones, should wear a Muslim headpiece called a fez. So we can see that there was a very high tolerance for the Muslims, and this is very out of line with the German racist views of Nazism. It was apparently very important for Himmler that the Muslims felt tolerated and respected. Himmler even made sure to let his underlings know that discrimination towards them would be punished. This seems very strange from our modern perception of the SS, and it even goes against the ideology of Nazism itself. But nevertheless, it shows us that history is more complex and full of paradoxes than it seems to be sometimes. Thus, we have some perceptions of the SS that does not correspond to the images conjured up by most individuals, and it is quite interesting that the SS were so tolerant to Muslims in their divisions, considering how most modern far-right groups are so heavily against Islam and Muslims. Now we have covered some aspects of how we remember the Waffen-SS, but what about the veterans themselves? What have they done after the war, and how have they wanted us to remember them and their organization? For this part, I will take a primary Danish perspective on the matter, but much of what the Danish SS veteran has done is reflected in many other countries where SS veterans have organized themselves after the war. A main problem with much of the early writings about the Waffen-SS is that many veterans in Denmark wanted to be remembered with mainly defensive writings. The veterans would often state that they had no anti-Semitic or racist views, but only wanted to combat Bolshevism in the East. In the rest of Europe, some veterans would also argue that they fought against American materialism and protected European culture and identity. The veterans in Denmark dominated the history writing about the Danish SS volunteer division, and it mainly consisted of memories and interviews with former volunteers. However, there was no real systematic and academic study of them until this Danish history book. This book made the much needed academic work to expand our vision of the Danish volunteers. Some veterans also tried to relativize the Holocaust and other war crimes by pointing the finger at abuses committed by the Allied forces. Furthermore, some veterans tried to reduce the involvement with war crimes by stating that they were derived from unstable individuals and thus non-representative for the SS as an organization. The narrative about the SS soldiers as a European bulwark against communism seemed like a popular message during the Cold War, because many popular history books were written with this tale by Danish veterans who fought in the war. Some writers like Erik Kern and Erik Host ended up selling a lot of copies of their books and sort of glorified the SS, and they pushed a narrative that the men were not so ideological and certainly not racist. The primary narrative was that they wanted to protect Europe from communism. However, there was a big problem with this. It stands clear that anti-Semitism was a core belief for the SS, along with racism, and that the Danish volunteers would be subject to ideological schooling, wherein they would learn about racism and the Nazi worldview. And it was not even uncommon for them to go to excursions to concentration camps. So even if the veterans themselves don't delve into it, they would still have been subject to racism. Even if they don't believe it themselves, it's highly unlikely that they didn't have some sympathy for the cause. It is also important that we no longer have only the relativized narrative about the SS organization and their role in the war, since we now have a more nuanced perspective on them and the Waffen-SS. All literature I used is written in the description. If you liked what you saw in this video, please leave a like and comment about what you would want for me to cover in the next video. Stay forever sharp and I'll see you guys next time.